The frozen encounter. Jack's boots crunched against the icy ground as he trudged through the endless white expanse. The freezing wind bit at his exposed skin despite the layers of thermal gear he wore. His breathing was heavy, and the sound of it echoed in his helmet, reminding him of how alone he was on this alien planet. A snowstorm was brewing in the distance, and he knew he needed to find shelter soon. The planet, known only as G17X, was a frozen wasteland, far from any major trade routes or colonies. Jack was a freelance explorer, mapping uncharted worlds and scavenging for resources. This time, he was searching for the remains of a rumored alien ship that had crash-landed here decades ago. So far, all he had found was endless ice, no sign of life or the ship. His thermal pod, parked several kilometers away, was his only refuge. As he adjusted his scanner, hoping for a faint energy signature, a weak blip appeared on the screen. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't strong, but it was there, an anomaly in the barren landscape. He followed the signal, his boots sinking into the snow with every step. The wind howled louder, as if warning him to turn back, but curiosity drove him forward. After what felt like an eternity, Jack saw something unusual ahead. A faint glow flickered beneath a thin layer of ice. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't just a random light. It was a figure. His eyes widened as he knelt down and cleared the frost with a gloved hand. Encased in the ice was a humanoid shape, delicate yet alien, with bluish skin and flowing silver hair frozen in place like a statue. "Holy, what are you?" Jack muttered, his voice trembling. He activated his helmet's translator, but there was no response from the figure. Whoever, or whatever, this was, they were still alive, barely. His scanner detected faint life signs, but they were fading quickly. Jack hesitated. His survival training screamed at him to leave, to focus on saving himself. He had limited supplies, and the storm was getting closer. But as he stared at the alien woman, something stirred in him. She was alone, vulnerable, and if he left her here, she wouldn't last another hour. With a sigh, Jack pulled out a portable heater from his pack and placed it on the ice. It hummed softly, melting the layer around the figure. As the ice thawed, her features became clearer. She had delicate, sharp features and markings on her arms that glowed faintly, even in her weakened state. Her clothing was strange, unlike anything Jack had seen before. It looked ceremonial, yet battle-worn. When the ice finally melted enough, Jack carefully pulled her out. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless in his arms. Her body was cold to the touch, like holding a block of ice. He quickly wrapped her in his thermal blanket and checked her pulse. It was faint but steady. "All right, lady. Let's get you out of here," Jack said, more to himself than her. He activated his locator beacon and began the trek back to his pod. The storm had caught up to him, snow whipping around in a chaotic frenzy. Visibility was nearly zero, but Jack pushed forward, each step heavier than the last. Halfway back, the alien stirred in his arms. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing large, luminous eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. She muttered something in a language Jack didn't understand, her voice weak and hoarse. "Hey, it's okay," Jack said, trying to sound calm. "I'm getting you to safety." She stared at him for a moment, confusion and fear in her gaze. Then, as if understanding his intent, she relaxed slightly, her eyes closing once more. Jack felt a strange pang of responsibility. He had no idea who she was or what she was doing here, but he couldn't let her die. The storm grew worse as they reached the pod. Jack struggled to open the hatch, his hands numb from the cold. When he finally got inside, he laid the alien woman on the cot and cranked up the heating system. The pod hummed to life, its warm interior a stark contrast to the icy world outside. Jack sat beside her, removing his helmet and wiping the frost from his face. He watched as her breathing became steadier, her skin losing some of its frozen pallor. She was alive, but barely. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice filled with curiosity. "And what happened to you?" The pod's sensors beeped, signaling the worsening storm outside. Jack knew they would be stuck here for hours, maybe even days. He leaned back, exhaustion washing over him, but his mind was restless. The alien woman was a mystery, and mysteries on this planet were rarely simple. As Jack closed his eyes for a brief moment, he couldn't help but wonder. Had he just saved her, or had he invited something far more dangerous into his life? Alien communication. The hum of the thermal pod filled the silence as Jack carefully adjusted the alien woman's makeshift bedding. Her breathing had stabilized, and the bluish hue of her skin now seemed to glow faintly under the pod's artificial lights. Jack sat cross-legged on the floor, scanning her with his handheld device. Her vitals were improving, but the readings were unlike anything he'd seen before. This wasn't just an alien species. This was something entirely unique. She stirred again, her eyelids fluttering open. This time, her luminous eyes locked onto Jack's with a clarity that sent a chill down his spine. She whispered something in a soft, melodic tone, her voice barely audible. "Whoa, easy there," Jack said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I don't understand, but you're safe now." The alien woman tilted her head, her gaze narrowing as she studied him. Her markings began to pulse faintly, reacting to his presence. Jack's translator device, mounted on his wrist, buzzed to life, attempting to process her language. The screen flickered, showing fragments of incomprehensible symbols. Frustrated, Jack muttered to himself, "Come on, you piece of junk. Work." The woman's lips moved again, and this time, a single word emerged, distorted but recognizable through the translator. "Help." Jack froze. "Help? Is that what you're saying?" He pointed to himself, then gestured toward her. "Me help you." Her eyes widened slightly, and she nodded, an unmistakable, universal gesture. Jack felt a surge of relief, but also a pang of worry. If she was asking for help, then her situation was likely more dire than he had imagined. "What happened to you?" he asked gently, though he doubted she could understand. He pointed to her, then mimicked a crash with his hands. Crash. Ship. Her face darkened, and she clenched her hands into fists. She muttered a string of words, faster this time, her voice filled with urgency. The translator buzzed again, piecing together fragments. "My people. Danger. Frozen." Jack leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "Danger. Frozen." He glanced at the small viewport, where the storm raged outside. "Your people are still out there." She nodded again, her movements sluggish but determined. She struggled to sit up, her body trembling from weakness. Jack instinctively moved to steady her, but she flinched at his touch. Her markings flared brighter for a moment before dimming again. Hey, it's okay," Jack said, backing off slightly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The alien woman closed her eyes briefly, as if regaining her composure. When she opened them again, she gestured toward a device on her wrist, a sleek piece of alien tech that appeared to be damaged. Jack examined it closely and realized it was some kind of locator or communication tool, though it was cracked and inactive. "This, your link to your people," Jack guessed. She nodded once more. "All right. Let me see if I can fix it." Jack rummaged through his toolkit, pulling out a soldering iron and a few multi-purpose circuits. The device was unlike anything he had worked on before, but he had a knack for figuring things out. As he worked, the alien woman watched him intently, her gaze darting between his hands and his face. There was a strange mix of curiosity and skepticism in her expression. "I'm Jack, by the way," he said, trying to fill the silence. He tapped his chest. "Jack." She hesitated before speaking the single word, her voice deliberate. "Lyra." Jack smiled faintly. "Lyra. That's a beautiful name." Lyra tilted her head again, as if trying to decipher his tone. Then she spoke softly, her words fragmented by the translator. "Why? Help me." Jack paused, his hands hovering over the device. He hadn't expected the question, but the answer came easily. Because you needed it. I couldn't just leave you out there. Lyra's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained guarded. She leaned back against the cot, her exhaustion evident. Jack returned to working on her device, his mind racing with questions. Who were her people? Why were they in danger? And what exactly had happened on this frozen planet? After an hour of careful tinkering, Jack managed to get the device to power up. A faint holographic display flickered to life, showing a map of the region. Several blinking dots marked locations across the icy landscape, but many of them were red, indicating failure. One, however, glowed a faint green. This one. Is this where your people are? Jack asked, pointing to the green dot. Lyra's eyes lit up with recognition, and she nodded vigorously. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. Jack caught her before she hit the ground, her body icy cold despite the warmth of the pod. Whoa, take it easy. You're not strong enough to go out there yet, he said firmly. We'll figure this out, but you need to rest first. Lyra glared at him, frustration evident in her expression, but she didn't argue. She allowed Jack to guide her back to the cot, though her markings flickered faintly with what he could only interpret as agitation. As Jack secured the pod for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. He had set out on this expedition to find resources, not to play hero to an alien woman with a cryptic story. But now, with Lyra's people potentially in danger and the storm raging outside, there was no turning back. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. Whatever lay ahead, he was determined to see it through. The cold devours. The storm outside howled like a living creature, shaking the thermal pod as Jack paced its small interior. Lyra lay on the cot, her glowing markings dim and flickering erratically, a clear sign of her deteriorating state. Jack had managed to stabilize her earlier, but her insistence on leaving the pod to reach her people weighed heavily on him. He didn't have the supplies for a long trek in these conditions, and her weakened body wouldn't survive the bitter cold for long. As Jack stared at the holographic map from Lyra's repaired device, the green dot pulsing faintly on the screen, the pod's sensors emitted a low warning tone. Jack froze, his gaze snapping to the display. The proximity alert was blinking, detecting movement outside. What now? Jack muttered, strapping on his thermal gloves and activating the external cameras. The pod's small monitors flickered to life, showing a grainy image of the snowstorm beyond. Shapes moved in the swirling frost. Large, hulking figures that appeared to blend with the icy terrain. Lyra stirred, her glowing eyes snapping open. She sat up abruptly, her body tense as she scanned the monitors. Her expression shifted from groggy confusion to sheer panic. What is it? Jack asked, noticing her reaction. What are those things? Lyra's voice was shaky as she muttered a single word. Devourers. The translator struggled to interpret her rapid speech as she continued, her tone laced with fear. They hunt. Frozen. Corrupted. No escape. Jack's blood ran cold. You're saying those things hunt people. Your people. Lyra nodded grimly, her trembling hand pointing to the camera feed. The creatures moved closer, their massive forms covered in jagged, frost-like armor. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly blue that matched the frozen wasteland around them. They didn't move like animals. Their movements were coordinated, almost tactical. Jack grabbed his rifle from the pod's supply rack, his hands tightening around the grip. Stay here. Don't move. Lyra grabbed his arm, her touch icy and firm. No, they, not stop. Together. Her broken words conveyed urgency, and Jack could see the determination in her glowing eyes. Fine, Jack muttered, handing her a small energy blade he had salvaged from a previous mission. But if you can't fight, stay behind me. The creatures reached the pod, their clawed hands scraping against the metal exterior. Jack felt the vibrations through the floor, each scrape setting his nerves on edge. He activated the pod's external defenses, a series of electrified panels designed to repel intruders. But the creatures barely flinched. Instead, they began to systematically probe the pod, searching for weaknesses. "They're smart," Jack realized, his voice grim. "Too smart." Lyra's markings flared brighter as she stepped forward, clutching the energy blade. She pressed a button on her wrist device, and a soft hum filled the pod. Jack glanced at her, puzzled. "What are you doing?" Lyra's voice was steadier now. "Signal. Disrupt. Weakness." The hum grew louder, and the creatures outside suddenly froze, their glowing eyes flickering like dying embers. Jack didn't wait to ask questions. He opened the hatch and fired a shot at the nearest creature, the energy bolt striking its frost-covered chest. The beast let out an otherworldly shriek, its icy armor cracking as it collapsed to the ground. "Nice work," Jack shouted, but his victory was short-lived. The remaining creatures recovered quickly, their movements now more erratic and desperate. One lunged at the open hatch, its claws swiping at Jack's head. He ducked just in time, firing another shot that barely grazed its shoulder. Lyra stepped forward, her blade glowing with energy. With a swift, fluid motion, she slashed at the creature, the blade cutting through its frozen armor like paper. Jack watched in awe as she moved with a grace that belied her earlier weakness. "You're full of surprises," Jack said, firing at another creature. "But we can't hold them off forever." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. She motioned toward the horizon, where the green dot on her device indicated the location of her people. "Run. Vault. Safe. Run? Are you serious?" Jack gestured to the storm outside, and the creatures swarming their pod. "We won't make it 10 feet before they tear us apart." Lyra's markings flared even brighter, casting an eerie glow in the cramped pod. She stepped closer to Jack, her voice low and urgent. "No choice. Here. Die. There. Chance." Jack clenched his jaw, realizing she was right. Staying in the pod was a death sentence. He grabbed his pack, checking his supplies one last time. "All right, we do this your way. But if we die, I'm blaming you." Lyra gave him a faint smile, her first since they had met, and nodded. Together, they braced themselves as Jack opened the hatch. The storm slammed into them immediately, the cold like a physical force. The creatures roared, their glowing eyes locking onto the pair. "Run," Jack shouted, firing his rifle to cover their retreat. Lyra moved with surprising speed, her blade flashing as she cut down any creature that got too close. Jack followed her lead, his heart pounding as they pushed through the blinding snow. The creatures gave chase, their guttural cries echoing through the storm. As they reached the edge of a frozen ridge, Lyra paused, her gaze scanning the area. She pointed to a narrow crevice ahead, her voice barely audible over the wind. "There. Safe." Jack didn't question her. He followed her into the crevice, the narrow walls shielding them from the worst of the storm. The creatures clawed at the entrance, but they were too large to fit through. Breathing heavily, Jack leaned against the icy wall, his rifle still in hand. That was too close. Lyra sank to the ground beside him, her glowing markings dimming once more. "Not over," she said, her tone heavy with exhaustion. "Vault? Far." Jack glanced at her, his determination hardening. "Then we'd better keep moving. I didn't come all this way to give up now." As they prepared to continue their journey, Jack couldn't help but wonder what awaited them at the vault, and whether they would survive long enough to find out. A race against time. The narrow crevice offered only temporary respite. The storm outside raged on, muffling the guttural cries of the cold devourers that prowled just beyond their reach. Jack leaned against the frozen wall, his chest heaving with each breath, the biting cold seeping through his gear. Beside him, Lyra sat motionless, her glowing markings dim and erratic. Her strength was fading, and every moment they delayed felt like a gamble against time. "Vault," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. She pointed weakly at the device on her wrist, its green dot blinking steadily. "We must reach it." Jack frowned as he checked their surroundings. The crevice was safe for now, but the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. His supplies were running low, just enough energy packs to power their thermal gear and a handful of rations. Worse, his rifle's battery was nearly depleted after their earlier encounter with the Devourers. He crouched beside Lyra, his voice steady but firm. "You're not strong enough to make it out there yet. You need to rest." "No time," she replied, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "My people, frozen. If we wait, they die." Jack sighed, his resolve wavering. Her words carried the weight of desperation and determination. He didn't understand the full extent of what was at stake, but he couldn't ignore the urgency in her voice. "All right," he said reluctantly, adjusting the strap of his pack. "But we're going to have to move fast. The longer we stay in the open, the harder it'll be to survive." Lyra nodded, her movements sluggish but resolute. Jack helped her to her feet, her icy touch sending a chill up his arm. Together, they stepped out of the crevice and into the storm, the wind howling like a living beast. Visibility was almost non-existent, the world reduced to a swirling vortex of white. Jack activated his thermal scanner, its faint glow providing a vague outline of the terrain ahead. The green dot on Lyra's device guided their path, though the journey was anything but straightforward. The icy ground was treacherous, and every step felt like a battle against nature itself. As they trudged forward, Jack kept glancing over his shoulder, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The cold Devourers were out there, he could feel it. The creatures had an unsettling intelligence, and he doubted they would give up so easily. "Lyra," Jack called out, his voice muffled by the wind. "What exactly are these Devourers? You said they're corrupted." She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Once, they were like me," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "My people, trapped in ice, too long. The cold changed them." Jack's stomach churned at the thought. "So, they're your people, but not anymore." Lyra nodded. "No mind, no soul, only hunger." The realization hit Jack like a punch to the gut. The creatures they had fought, vicious, unrelenting monsters, were once living beings with families and lives of their own. It made their mission to the vault feel even more critical, yet infinitely more dangerous. As they climbed a steep ridge, the storm began to ease, revealing the desolate beauty of the frozen landscape. Jagged ice formations jutted out of the ground like crystalline spires, glittering in the faint light of a distant star. In the distance, a faint glow marked the location of the vault, a structure buried deep beneath the ice. "There," Lyra said, her voice filled with a glimmer of hope. "We're close." Jack studied the terrain ahead, noting the lack of cover and the open expanse leading to the vault. It was a death trap if the Devourers were still on their trail. "We'll need to be fast," Jack said, gripping his rifle tightly. "If those things catch us out in the open." Before he could finish, a bone-chilling roar echoed across the ridge. Jack's blood ran cold as he turned to see the Devourers emerging from the storm, their glowing eyes piercing through the haze. There were more of them now, their massive forms moving with terrifying speed. "Run," Jack shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her forward. They sprinted down the ridge, the icy ground threatening to send them tumbling with every step. The Devourers were gaining ground, their cries growing louder and more frenzied. As they neared the vault's location, Jack saw the faint outline of a metal hatch embedded in the ice. It was partially exposed, but the thick layer of frost covering it made it impossible to access without tools. "Lyra, can you open it?" Jack asked, panic creeping into his voice. Lyra knelt beside the hatch, her markings flaring brightly as she pressed her wrist device against it. The device emitted a low hum, and the hatch shuddered, but it didn't budge. "Ice, too thick," she said, her voice strained. Jack cursed under his breath, and pulled out a thermal cutter from his pack. "Keep them back," he shouted, igniting the tool and directing its intense heat at the ice. The frost melted slowly, far too slowly for his liking. Lyra stood guard, clutching her energy blade as the devourers closed in. Her movements were swift and precise, each strike cutting through the creature's icy armor. But for every one she took down, two more appeared, their relentless advance showing no signs of stopping. "Hurry!" Lyra yelled, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "I'm trying," Jack snapped, sweat dripping down his face despite the freezing temperature. The hatch finally gave way with a groan, revealing a dark tunnel leading into the depths of the vault. "Go inside," Jack shouted, pulling Lyra toward the opening. They scrambled into the tunnel just as the first devourer lunged, its claws scraping against the hatch as Jack slammed it shut. The sound of their furious roars echoed through the metal, but the thick barrier held. Jack collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. Lyra sank to the floor beside him, her glowing markings flickering weakly. The vault's interior was cold and dark, the faint hum of machinery the only sign of life. "We made it," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But what now?" Lyra pointed deeper into the tunnel, her gaze resolute. "My people, there, still frozen. You must help me wake them." Jack stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. The danger wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun. Breaking the ice. The tunnel stretched into darkness, its metallic walls coated in a thin layer of frost. Jack's breath formed clouds in the cold, dim air as he adjusted his grip on the thermal cutter. Lyra walked beside him, her steps faltering but determined. Her glowing markings flickered weakly, their brightness dimming with every passing moment. The faint hum of ancient machinery reverberated through the air, a reminder that the vault still held power. Barely. Ahead, the green dot on Lyra's wrist device blinked steadily, guiding them deeper into the frozen labyrinth. "How far is it?" Jack asked, his voice echoing slightly. "Not far," Lyra replied, her tone strained. "Central chamber holds them." Jack glanced at her, noting the exhaustion etched into her features. He wanted to tell her to rest, but he knew she wouldn't stop, not until they reached her people. Instead, he focused on the task ahead, his mind racing with questions. What would they find in the central chamber? Could they even revive her people after all this time? The tunnel began to widen, revealing a massive chamber encased in ice. Jack's flashlight swept across the space, illuminating rows upon rows of stasis pods embedded in the walls. Each pod was covered in a thick layer of frost, their surfaces obscured by the passage of time. "Is this it?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with awe. Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the chamber. "My people, frozen here, waiting for rescue." Jack approached one of the pods, wiping away the frost with his gloved hand. Inside, a figure was barely visible. A humanoid form, similar to Lyra, with glowing markings that had dimmed to near extinction. Their eyes were closed, their expression peaceful, as if asleep. "They're alive?" Jack asked, his breath hitching. "For now," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "But the system, failing. If we do not act, they will die." Jack turned his attention to the control panel at the center of the chamber. The ancient console was covered in frost, its display flickering erratically. He activated his thermal cutter, using it to melt the ice away. As the frost dripped to the floor, the console powered up, emitting a low hum. "All right," Jack muttered, his fingers hovering over the alien symbols on the screen. "Let's see if I can figure this out." Lyra joined him, her hand shaking as she pressed a sequence of buttons on her wrist device. The console's display changed, showing a diagnostic report in a language Jack couldn't read. Lyra translated quickly, her words clipped. "Power low. Systems. Critical. We need external energy." Jack's stomach sank. "External energy? You mean the stasis pods can't work without it?" Lyra nodded. We must. Transfer power. Your pod, can it help? Jack froze. His thermal pod was their only lifeline back to his ship. Without it, he had no way of surviving on this frozen planet. But as he looked at the rows of stasis pods, each one holding a life on the brink of extinction, he knew there wasn't really a choice. Fine, he said, swallowing hard. I'll rig the core from my pod to transfer power. But if this doesn't work, we're both dead. Lyra's gaze softened, gratitude flickering in her glowing eyes. You save us. My people will remember. Jack didn't respond. He was already focused on the task, pulling out a toolkit and connecting the thermal pod's portable power core to the console. The process was delicate, requiring precision and speed. Every second felt like an eternity as he worked, the cold gnawing at his fingers despite his gloves. As the final connection was made, the console emitted a loud beep, and the chamber's lights flickered to life. The stasis pods began to hum softly, their frosted surfaces glowing faintly. It's working, Jack said, relief washing over him. But the moment was short-lived. A loud, bone-chilling roar echoed through the chamber, followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal. Jack's heart sank as he realized the cold devourers had found them. They're here, he said, grabbing his rifle and positioning himself between the entrance and the console. Lyra, how much time do we need? Lyra glanced at the console, her expression grim. Minutes, maybe less. We don't have minutes, Jack muttered, his eyes fixed on the dark tunnel. The first of the devourers appeared, its glowing eyes piercing the dim light. Behind it, more shadows moved, their guttural growls growing louder. Jack fired his rifle, the energy bolt striking the lead devourer and sending it sprawling. Another lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. Jack sidestepped just in time, delivering a quick shot that took it down. Lyra, hurry, he shouted, his voice strained. Lyra's hands flew across the console, her markings flaring brightly as she worked. The stasis pods began to emit a louder hum, their systems coming back online. One by one, the figures inside began to stir, their glowing markings flickering weakly. It's working, Lyra cried, her voice filled with hope. Jack didn't have time to celebrate. The devourers were relentless, their sheer numbers overwhelming. He fired shot after shot, his rifle's battery draining rapidly. As one devourer closed in, Jack swung the rifle like a club, the impact knocking it back, but leaving him vulnerable. Suddenly, a bright flash of light filled the chamber. Jack turned to see Lyra standing in the center of the room, her markings blazing like a beacon. The devourers recoiled, their growls turning to whimpers as they backed away. What are you doing? Jack asked, his voice awed. Lyra's voice was steady, her words filled with quiet power. They fear light, warmth. I will hold them back. You protect my people. Jack nodded, his respect for Lyra growing with every passing moment. As she held the devourers at bay, he turned back to the stasis pods, ensuring the power transfer continued smoothly. One by one, the figures inside began to awaken, their eyes opening to a world that had nearly forgotten them. As the last of the devourers retreated into the shadows, Lyra collapsed to her knees, her glow fading. Jack rushed to her side, catching her before she fell. You did it, he said, his voice filled with admiration. Lyra smiled weakly, her gaze shifting to the newly awakened members of her people. No, we did it, together. But as the hum of the stasis pods filled the chamber, Jack knew the battle wasn't over. They had saved Lyra's people for now, but the frozen planet held more dangers and more secrets than either of them had anticipated. The stasis vault. The soft hum of the stasis pods filled the chamber as the first of Lyra's people began to stir. Their glowing markings flickered weakly, the alien figures inside slowly regaining consciousness after what must have been decades, or perhaps centuries, of frozen stasis. Jack knelt beside Lyra, her exhaustion evident as she leaned against the console, her breathing shallow but steady. "You all right?" Jack asked, his voice low. Lyra nodded faintly, her glowing eyes fixed on the pods. "They wake, but not strong." Her voice was barely above a whisper, each word carrying the weight of her determination and fatigue. Jack stood and scanned the room. The console's diagnostic panel showed the power transfer was holding steady, but the strain on his thermal pod's core was evident. A red warning light blinked ominously, signaling that the energy reserves wouldn't last long. "We've bought some time," Jack said, glancing at the flickering green light on the console. "But this core won't keep them alive for long. We need a permanent solution." Lyra's gaze shifted to the awakened figures, some of whom were now sitting upright in their pods, their eyes wide with confusion. One of them, a tall male with deep azure markings, stepped forward, his movements sluggish but purposeful. He spoke in the same melodic language as Lyra, his voice carrying a tone of authority. "What's he saying?" Jack asked, glancing at Lyra. Lyra struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on the console. "He is Varen, my brother, leader of our colony." Varen turned his sharp gaze toward Jack, his eyes narrowing. He spoke again, his tone firm and questioning. Jack didn't need a translator to understand the suspicion in the man's voice. "He doesn't trust me," Jack guessed, his lips pressing into a thin line. Lyra placed a hand on Varen's arm, her glowing markings pulsing faintly as she spoke to him in their native tongue. Jack watched as her brother's expression softened, though the tension in his posture remained. After a moment, Varen stepped forward and inclined his head slightly, a gesture that Jack interpreted as reluctant gratitude. "He thanks you," Lyra said, her voice steadier now, "for saving us." Jack gave a curt nod. "Don't mention it. But if we're going to keep you all alive, we need a way to restore full power to this place. The core from my pod won't last forever." Varen exchanged a glance with Lyra, and the two began speaking rapidly in their language. Lyra turned to Jack, her expression grim but resolute. "There is a central generator, deep in the vault. If we restart it, the stasis pods and defenses will function again." "Defenses?" Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. "You're saying this place has weapons?" Lyra nodded. "Built to protect, from the cold devours. But generator, damaged long ago." Jack's shoulders sagged. "Of course it's damaged. Nothing's ever easy." Varen stepped forward, gesturing for Jack to follow. His markings flared slightly as he spoke, his tone commanding. Lyra translated. "He will take us to the generator. But we must move quickly. The devourers will return." Jack gripped his rifle tightly. "Lead the way." The descent to the generator. The group moved cautiously through the labyrinthine corridors of the vault. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint hum of machinery became increasingly sporadic. Jack kept his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Lyra walked beside him, her glow providing faint illumination in the dim passageways. As they descended deeper, the walls began to show signs of damage. Deep claw marks gouged into the metal, as if the devourers had attempted to breach the vault in the past. Jack's stomach churned at the thought of facing them again in such confined quarters. "How did this happen?" Jack asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Your people, the devourers. Why did it come to this?" Lyra's expression darkened. "The cold. It is alive. A force, sentient. It corrupts, twists. My people were not strong enough to resist." Jack frowned. "The cold is alive. That's unsettling. It hunts," Lyra continued, her voice heavy. "The devourers are its creations, to destroy us." Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. He had seen a lot in his time as an explorer, but an enemy like this, one that was everywhere and nowhere, was unlike anything he had faced before. The group finally reached the generator room, a massive chamber filled with ancient machinery. At the center stood a towering device, its core dark and lifeless. Frost coated every surface, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. Varen approached the generator, his markings glowing brighter as he examined it. He spoke to Lyra, who turned to Jack. "The core is intact," she said, relief evident in her voice. "But the conduits are frozen. They must be cleared." Jack sighed, pulling out his thermal cutter. "Let me guess. It's my job to clear them." Lyra gave a faint smile. "You are good with tools." "Lucky me," Jack muttered, stepping forward. He began cutting through the thick layers of frost that encased the conduits, the heat from the tool melting the ice into steaming puddles. The process was slow and grueling, every second feeling like an hour. As he worked, a faint rumble echoed through the chamber. Jack paused, glancing over his shoulder. What was that? Lyra's markings flared brighter. "They are here." The final stand. The rumbling grew louder, followed by the familiar, bone-chilling roars of the devourers. Jack cursed under his breath, gripping his rifle as the first of the creatures burst into the chamber. They were larger than before, their icy armor thicker, their movements faster. Varen and Lyra stepped forward, their glowing markings flaring like beacons. They moved with synchronized precision, Lyra's energy blade flashing as she cut through one devourer, while Varen's strikes sent another crashing to the ground. Jack fired at a third creature, his shots barely slowing it down. "I can't hold them off forever," he shouted, dodging a swipe of its massive claws. Lyra turned to him, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Finish the conduits. We will hold them." Jack didn't argue. He returned to the generator, his hands working frantically to clear the remaining ice. The conduits began to hum as power surged through them, the generator's core flickering to life. "Almost there," Jack called out, his heart pounding. As the last conduit thawed, the generator roared to life, sending a wave of warmth and light through the chamber. The devourers recoiled, their icy armor cracking under the sudden heat. One by one, they collapsed, their forms disintegrating into piles of frost. Jack slumped against the generator, his chest heaving. Lyra and Varen approached, their glowing markings dimming as the immediate threat passed. "It's done," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "But I get the feeling this fight isn't over." Lyra nodded, her gaze resolute. "The cold will return. But now, we are ready." As the generator's warmth spread through the vault, awakening more of Lyra's people, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had become part of something far greater than himself. The battle against the cold was just beginning, but for the first time, they had a fighting chance. A warm hope. The generator thrummed steadily, its warmth radiating throughout the stasis vault. The frost that had once encased the walls began to melt, forming rivulets of water that trickled onto the floor. The pods lining the chamber hummed to life, their occupants slowly stirring as the warmth reached them. For the first time in decades, perhaps centuries, the frozen colony was alive again. Jack stood at the base of the generator, his hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. His thermal gear was soaked with sweat, but the ache in his muscles was nothing compared to the relief washing over him. Lyra approached, her glowing markings now steady and bright, a sign of her restored strength. Behind her, Varen guided the newly awakened colonists, their movements slow but growing steadier with each passing moment. "It's working," Jack said, his voice hoarse but triumphant. "Your people, they're waking up." Lyra's gaze swept over the room, her expression a mix of relief and resolve. "Because of you," she said softly. "You gave us a chance." Jack shrugged, his usual sarcasm tempered by the weight of the moment. "It wasn't just me. You held off those devourers. Your brother, your people, they're the reason this place is still standing." Varen approached, his towering frame imposing but his expression solemn. He spoke in his native tongue, his voice resonating with authority. Lyra translated, her tone filled with reverence. "He says you are an ally now, Jack, a protector of our people. Jack chuckled dryly. Protector, I think I prefer lucky fool who didn't get eaten. But I'll take it. The faint smile on Lyra's face faded as she glanced toward the tunnel leading back to the surface. Her markings flickered briefly, a sign of unease. The cold devours, they will return. The storm, it never stops hunting. Jack followed her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. The cold wasn't just a force of nature. It was a living, malevolent entity, and they had only bought themselves time. What can we do? Jack asked, his voice serious. We've got the generator running, but it's only a matter of time before those things come back. Lyra hesitated, exchanging a glance with Varen. He nodded, stepping back to guide the others while Lyra turned to Jack. There is a way, she said, her voice low. But it is dangerous. Jack raised an eyebrow. Dangerous is becoming my middle name. What's the plan? The heart of the vault. Lyra led Jack deeper into the vault, past corridors and chambers that had remained untouched for centuries. The walls grew darker, the ice thicker, as if the cold was reluctant to release its grip on this part of the structure. Finally, they reached a massive door, its surface etched with intricate alien symbols that glowed faintly in response to Lyra's presence. This, Lyra said, placing her hand on the door, is the heart of the vault. It was built to harness warmth, a weapon against the cold. Jack frowned, examining the symbols. A weapon? Why didn't you use it before? Lyra's gaze darkened. It requires sacrifice. A living being must connect to the core, sharing their energy to ignite it. The process is irreversible. Jack's stomach twisted at the implication. You're saying someone has to give their life to power this thing? Lyra nodded. It is why we never used it. But now, we have no choice. Jack stared at her, the weight of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. You're not seriously thinking off. I must. Lyra interrupted, her voice firm. My people need a future. The cold will never stop until we end it. Jack shook his head, stepping between her and the door. No way. There's got to be another way. I didn't drag you out of the ice just to lose you now. Lyra's markings flared brightly, her expression softening. Jack, you saved me. You gave me hope when I thought all was lost. Let me give my people the same chance. A different kind of sacrifice. Before Jack could argue further, Varen appeared, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the corridor. He spoke to Lyra in their language, his tone resolute. Lyra's eyes widened in shock, and she shook her head. What's he saying? Jack asked, his gaze darting between them. Lyra hesitated, her voice trembling as she translated. He will take my place. As leader, it is his duty. Jack watched as Varen stepped forward, placing his hand on the door. His markings flared brightly, the symbols on the door responding with a soft hum. Lyra grabbed his arm, pleading with him in their tongue, but he gently pushed her back, his expression calm. No, Lyra said, her voice breaking as she turned to Jack. He cannot. He is all we have left. Jack's mind raced, a desperate idea forming. Wait, what if we don't need a sacrifice? What if we can use something else to power it? Lyra frowned. What do you mean? Jack held up the power core from his thermal pod, its casing cracked and leaking faint energy. This core isn't just power, it's designed to amplify and stabilize. Maybe it can bridge the gap. Lyra's eyes widened with hope. It could work, but it is unstable. Jack grinned wryly. Unstable seems to be our theme today. Igniting the heart, Jack and Lyra worked quickly, connecting the core to the door's interface. The ancient mechanisms groaned to life, the symbols glowing brighter as energy surged through the system. The door shuddered, then slowly slid open, revealing a massive chamber filled with pulsing, fiery light. At its center was the heart of the vault, a radiant orb suspended in midair, its warmth pushing back the icy chill. It's beautiful, Jack muttered, shielding his eyes from the intense glow. Lyra stepped forward, her markings glowing in harmony with the orb. She placed her hands on its surface, her expression one of awe and reverence. "This is what will save us." Jack connected the core to the orb, his hands trembling as he adjusted the settings. The room shook as the heart absorbed the energy, its light intensifying until the entire chamber was bathed in warmth. Outside, the vault's defenses roared to life. Heat waves radiated outward, pushing back the cold and disintegrating the devourers as they tried to breach the vault. The storm outside began to dissipate, the once relentless blizzard calming into a gentle snowfall. A future rekindled. As the heart stabilized, Jack leaned against the wall, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. Lyra approached, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it." Jack managed a weak smile. "So, what now?" Lyra looked toward the awakening colony, her expression filled with hope. "Now, we rebuild. Together." Jack nodded, feeling a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. The cold might return one day, but for now, they had warmth and hope, and that was enough.